yoga board is going to talk about our fourth niyama. And our fourth niyama is the word svadhyaya. And svadhyaya is this concept of self-study or self-inquiry and self-awareness. I feel like it is a topic that's really central to our yoga practice. We're constantly using our physical practice, our hatha practice, as a vehicle for self-study. A lot of what we're trying to do when we're on our mat and we're doing any different sort of pose is to see what our initial reaction is to it, to see how we evolve through that pose. There's the saying that yoga is not about touching your toes, it's about what you learn on the way down. It's what you learn during that progression of deepening your practice. So Svadyaya is a really deep question, and it's the question of who am I? And then in parentheses I put really. Who am I really? Not the fake labels, I shouldn't say fake, but the external labels that we put on ourselves, like what our profession is, or even our status in the family, if you're a wife or a husband, a brother or sister, a co-worker, and any number of labels that you put on yourself, and that's how you identify yourself. But that's really on a very superficial level, thinking of yourself as these external labels. And that comes from a strong cultural condition that when you meet someone, one of the first things that you would ask them is where they live or what they do for a living. Do they have children? Do they not have children? All of these things start to put labels on people, and then we kind of know how to interact with them better. But in yoga, we're constantly going back to this concept of connecting to the self, and this is the self with a capital S, meaning not the external labels that we carry around, but the soul, the spirit that's actually within us that animates our body. So when we start to let go of those external labels and we're able to dive down deeper, we start to see something that's a lot more permanent. So you might change your career, your kids might grow up and move away, and then your labels and your roles start to change. Our physical body, this packaging that we find ourselves in, changes day to day, month to month, year to year. And if you identify really strongly with the way that you look or the way that your body works as you age, it's going to be this really hard process of trying to understand these changes and almost losing this sense of being connected to your body. I see a lot of people who become very disillusioned as they're aging and their body isn't working the way that it once was. And they connect so strongly with that body, and they don't have a strong connection to their internal world. So it's a very difficult process for anybody, but especially if you're not connected to the inner self, the deeper, more eternal version of self. At the end of a yoga class, when we bow to each other and we say namaste, we're saying that I acknowledge the divine light or the spark of the divine or your soul. It's acknowledging that you have that within yourself and you see it also within that other person, that there's this connection there that you're on the same level with. If you've ever seen the movie Avatar, they have this phrase where they'll say to each other, I see you. And it's very similar to that kind of concept. It's not I physically see you, but it's I see you on a deep spiritual level or a soul level. So I like to draw that comparison. But this concept of who am I is a very simple question, 3 words, and most people can answer that pretty quickly with those external labels, but when you start to have them dive deeper down into the layers, then it becomes a more difficult thing to define. If you've ever followed the teachings of Eckhart Tolle, or if you've read his book, The Power of Now, he discusses this question very strongly when he starts to examine the process of the mind. And in yoga we call it the waves of the mind, the thoughts and the patterns that rise up. And watching that, you start to have this question of, well, if my mind is having all of these thoughts and I'm kind of sitting back here watching those thoughts like they're being projected onto a board or a screen, then who is that person that's watching, or that entity that's watching those thoughts? It creates this separation between your mind as one thing and then the self, the true self, being this completely other thing. And for a lot of people, myself included, when I read that in the book, it was kind of this mind-blowing concept that there's this separation between who you actually are and the processes that go on in your mind. It can be a very liberating concept, especially if you suffer from any sort of mental disorder or mental health issue. If you suffer from depression or anxiety or schizophrenia or any number of problems like that, you can understand that your soul, your spirit, is this separate thing from the mind. And the mind is where something has gone awry, something is off in the process of the mind, and it's not actually the true you, the true self, or the capital S self, that has that dysfunction. The same applies for your physical body. When we associate really, really strongly with our vessel, and then something goes wrong and you need surgery, or in the really extreme case where you might have a limb amputated or something like that, it's feeling like they've broken a part of you or taken off a part of you, where it can be really helpful in those situations to be able to recognize the fact that the internal self and the physical body are two separate things. So one of the things that I talked a lot about in class this week was this whole mind, body, spirit phrase. It's something that's pretty much become a cliche to say, oh, yoga is a mind, body, spirit practice, or any number of different things. Take care of your mind, body, and spirit. But those three different things are really the three components that make up the puzzle, that make up us. We have the mind and the thought process and our thinking, and we can look at that as an entity to itself, as a whole separate thing. Like you could hold it right here and watch your thought process. And then you can change over and look at just your physical body, or feel just your physical body, noticing what that feels like to reside in that vessel. And then you can separate that into a third component, which is the true self, or the spirit, or the soul, whatever word you like to put onto that. And you can see those three things as being very distinct and very separate. Now, having a disconnect between your mind and your body can cause issues, definitely health-wise, and spirit disconnect from dwelling in your body can cause all sorts of issues during your life. So we use our practice to create a union between all three of those, and that's really the deep meaning of what yoga is. Yoga means to yoke or to unify. And we're trying to create union between the mind, the communication lines between the body and the mind and the body, and the soul or the spirit, and having all three of those in really close union. The vehicle that creates that union is our breath. Our breath is what tethers our soul into our body. When we stop breathing, that's when those two things part ways. And the connection between that is our mind. So we couldn't control our breath without having the mental process to think about slowing our inhale and working on our exhale and being aware of all the different components of our breath. So there's this connection that has to happen between those three pieces, but it can be really helpful to distinguish between them as three separate things. The other important part of this self-reflection is after you've kind of pondered this idea of who am I, and I put the little red outline around the eye because it's not just the external eye, it's the internal eye. Who am I really? Then it's asking yourself, well, what are my gifts? We spend a tremendous amount of time criticizing ourselves and thinking about what we need to get better at. But take a step back and think about you as an individual. What are your gifts? Are you good at teaching? Are you good at working with children? Are you good at cooking? What is it that you are really good at, or maybe that you're really passionate about? Because those are the things that you're going to do best. Those are the things that you were put on this earth to share with other people. Whether it ends up being the way that you earn your living or not, those are things that you're still supposed to be sharing with the people around you. So that's a great thing to think about. What are my gifts that I need to share with the world around me? Why was I put here? Now, as we go deeper into this concept of self-awareness, in the scope of yoga, we've been talking about the yamas and the niyamas, and we're getting towards the end. So at this point, the niyamas start to say, well, look back, look at the other yamas and niyamas, and think, how well am I adhering to them? And this is a constant process of just watching how you're doing with your awareness of compassion, or your practice of not lying, or your practice of not stealing, any of those things that we've talked about previously. This is your time to set aside a moment to reflect on how well you're adhering to those rules. Now for me, I started to see a little bit of an issue here, because we talk a lot about non-judgment. We don't want to judge. We're not trying to put a label on everything as good or bad, desirable or undesirable, because that's going to create suffering. So how do we step back and say, well, am I living the yamas and the niyamas? Am I really embracing them? So in my mind, I've created a distinction between judgment and assessment. So judgment would be, I don't know, maybe say if I'm working on my practice of ahimsa and I'm trying to refine my diet down to being vegan, and I had pizza the other day. So there was cheese on that pizza, and I'm trying to cut down on cheese, and I thought, that was really, I was weak. Why wasn't I stronger? Why wasn't I able to say no to that piece of pizza that was put in front of me? I should have done a better job of practicing ahimsa, and that would be the judgment within me, saying that to myself. It's rather harsh, and it definitely causes a level of suffering. So then we can go over to the end of assessment. And assessment is, I'd say, maybe a little bit more cut and dry and less emotionally charged. So assessment would say something like, okay, we're trying to cut out dairy from our diet, and you had a vegan breakfast and you had a vegan lunch, but then when it came to dinner time, you ate that piece of pizza, not vegan. So you got 2 out of 3. Next time, let's go for 3 out of 3. So you can see the difference between the same information being presented and the really judgmental reaction that I could have to that situation, or the assessment that I could have of that situation. The difference is going to be the level of suffering that it causes me, the level of difficulty that it causes me, but it's still going to help me to understand how closely I'm living the yamas or the niyamas, whatever one I'm examining at that point. So just keep that in mind as you're going through this path. Try not to fall back into that pattern of judgment, because we're really good at judging, but it's going to cause more suffering in the end. So try not to be that harsh with yourself. Try to stick with that assessment style. That brings us down to the idea of having full awareness and full presence during your day. We want to watch ourselves, to notice the areas in our day where we switch on to autopilot. And usually it's kind of a habitual thing. It might be when you're at work and you're getting toward that 2:30 in the afternoon mark, and you're tired and you're waiting for the workday to be over, and you're just kind of or it might be when you're driving. A lot of us, when we're driving, we're thinking, and you're stuck in your head. Next thing you know, you get to your destination and you can't really remember in detail how you got there. So that would be the example of switching on autopilot. So notice what your patterns are, and the next time that you're driving or doing whatever it is where you normally kind of zone out, see if you can create this really intense presence during that period of time or during that activity. And that's going to give you an opportunity to be present, to be aware, and to watch yourself. Watch what your thought process is, watch what feelings start to come up. It's an opportunity to practice inquiry into yourself, to practice self-awareness. And in that process, we're doing this whole procedure of peeling back our layers to get to that true self. So during that drive, you might be thinking, why did I eat that piece of pizza? Or, oh, I didn't finish that report yesterday. Why didn't I finish that report? Now it's going to put me behind for today. All sorts of things like that. And you can notice that that's on a really external level. It might be completely outside of yourself, something you needed to do. It might be something with your body of, well, I ate that piece of pizza and now I feel my stomach doesn't feel right, or I just feel like I'm fat, or something of that nature. And it's very directed at our physical body, which is another one of those sheaths. Or it might be something in your energy field that you just feel kind of off that day. And little by little we start to go deeper and deeper and deeper until you find that really still steadiness at the core. And I find it to be something that's very comforting, because I know if I can go through that process of peeling back the layers and peeling back the layers, letting go of the judgment on each of those layers, then I can get to that place of where everything is always still and everything is always completely balanced and I have focus. So that would be the level of the inner self. I think of it like the eye of a hurricane, where everything around it can be all crazy and swirling around, but I can always focus myself into the eye of the hurricane, or I can always choose to physically exist within the eye of that hurricane and let all sorts of chaos be going on around me, but I can stay within that stillness. That's always a visual that is really helpful to me when things are kind of going crazy during my day. But make sure that you recognize the things that are true self and the things that are not true self. You are not your job. You are not your roles in your life. All of those things are very superficial. So the practice that we're going to do is giving us an opportunity to watch our reaction in all sorts of different situations that we come across in yoga. And we often put these categories on our yoga poses. We have forward bends, we have back bends, we have hip openers, we have chest openers, we have inversions, all these different categories. So during the practice, I'm going to try to create a really good mixture of a little bit of everything. And your job is, as you go through that practice, to see what you tend to have an attachment to, what you tend to have an aversion to, what poses you wish you could get out of sooner, what poses you tend to gravitate toward and you feel like you really enjoy those poses. Just watch the process, watch the thoughts that rise up when you're in all these different situations. So it's a very eclectic hatha practice, very mixed, a little bit of everything. The pranayama that I picked for this practice is Brahmari, or the Hummingbird breath. And I really like this breath. I actually practice it pretty much every day. If I'm going to work, I practice it for probably anywhere from 5 to 8 minutes during my car ride to work, and I use it as a way to focus and clear my mind. A lot of times when I'm driving to work, mentally I'm already at work, and I try to prevent that from happening, and this breath has been really helpful for me to do that. Now you might be thinking, the traditional Brahmari breath, you're covering your eyes and covering your ears and covering your face. I don't do that when I'm driving. So I just do the Brahmari breath with the humming in my throat, and my eyes are open and I'm very alert to what I'm doing when I'm driving. Actually, I find it easier to focus on driving when I do that, because I don't get lost in my thoughts and thinking about what I have to do when I get to wherever I'm going. So I find it a really good mindfulness practice for driving. But we're going to do the regular Brahmari breath with just the humming, and then we're going to add in the mudra. The Shanmukti mudra is that finger position where we close the eyes, we rest at the nose, we rest around the mouth, and we close the entrance to the ears so that when we hum, it's this full awareness of our internal state. We're trying to create that increased awareness of our inner world, that really rich environment that we hold inside of us. The mantra that we're going to use is a mantra that I used when I was at the Yogaville ashram in Virginia. So this mantra is, I am not my body, I am not my mind, I am the eternal self. And to me, that mantra really embodies this idea of using the process of self-study and the process of self-awareness to understand what the true self is and what the true self isn't. So your body and your thought process is not the true self. Your labels and your roles in life, not your true self. The true self is this very, very deep level inside your being that takes some work to get to and to be aware of. But this mantra is going to remind you not to identify with those external aspects of yourself. So I hope you can join me for the physical practice that we're going to do to tie this all together and practice our svadhyaya to make sure that we have this constant awareness of self-study and self-awareness. Namaste. Thank you for watching.